"I never had a wife," said the lonely mountain man. Then 2 widows begged for shelter. Jonas Hawk lived alone, far from the bustling settlements and crowded streets. His home was nestled deep in the wild hills of a far-off planet, where the air was thin and the wind howled like the cries of forgotten souls. The towering peaks and wide-open plains stretched out as far as the eye could see, and the silence was broken only by the calls of distant creatures and the crackle of firewood. The stars overhead were close enough to touch, and the moonlight bathed everything in a soft silver glow. For years, Jonas had kept to himself. He had no family, no friends. He needed no one. He had built a small cabin with his own hands, a humble home that sat at the edge of a dense forest. The only company he kept were the animals he hunted and the occasional passerby who ventured through the wilderness. Most people stayed away. They called him a lonely mountain man or a ghost of the hills, and they spoke of him with both fear and curiosity. He didn't mind. He had no interest in the world beyond his mountain. But sometimes, in the stillness of the long nights, Jonas found himself longing for something more. The isolation that had once brought him peace now gnawed at him. He couldn't remember the last time he had spoken to anyone for more than a few minutes. He'd never had a wife, never had children. It had never bothered him much, but now, the thought of living alone forever began to feel like a heavy weight in his chest. It was late one evening when the change came. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and a fierce storm had started to roll in from the east. The wind picked up, and dark clouds gathered, turning the sky a deep shade of gray. Jonas stood outside, watching the storm with a mix of appreciation and unease. He loved the wildness of the storms, the way the mountains seemed to come alive with the thunder and the lightning, but tonight, something felt different. A strange unease settled over him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. As the first raindrops began to fall, Jonas turned to head back inside. But just as he reached the door of his cabin, he heard it. A knock. At first he thought it was the wind, but then it came again, louder this time, more urgent. Someone was at his door. Jonas froze. He wasn't used to visitors. Most people avoided this part of the planet, and the ones who did come through rarely stayed for long. But the knock was persistent, and after a moment of hesitation, Jonas stepped forward and opened the door. Standing in the doorway were 2 women, soaked to the bone and shivering from the cold. They looked like they had walked for miles through the storm. Their clothes were torn, their faces pale, and their eyes wide with fear. "Please," one of the women said, her voice trembling, "we need shelter. Just for the night. We have nowhere else to go." Jonas studied them, his sharp eyes taking in their appearance. One was tall, with dark hair that clung to her face. The other was shorter, with blonde hair that framed her face in loose waves. Both women looked exhausted, as if they had been running from something, and their eyes held a deep sadness, a kind of pain that Jonas could feel in his bones. For a moment he considered turning them away. He was used to his solitude, and the idea of inviting strangers into his home was uncomfortable. But something in their eyes stopped him. The storm outside was growing worse, and he knew that if he sent them away, they would likely perish in the cold. With a heavy sigh, Jonas stepped aside. "Come in," he said gruffly, though his voice lacked the warmth that might have reassured them.
"You'll catch your death out there."
The women hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The warmth of the cabin seemed to make them relax, and they gratefully shook the water from their coats. Jonas didn't offer them tea or comfort. He simply watched as they settled by the fire, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. "I'm Jonas," he said after a while, his voice low but steady. "What are your names?" The taller woman spoke first, her voice soft yet steady. "I'm Anna," she said, "and this is Clara." Jonas nodded, keeping his distance. He wasn't one for small talk, and he could tell that the women were not interested in idle chatter either. They both looked worn down, their faces drawn with fatigue and grief. He wondered briefly what had brought them to his doorstep, but he didn't ask. It wasn't his place to pry. For the next few hours they sat in silence, the only sound in the cabin, the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. As the night wore on, Jonas noticed the 2 women exchanging looks, their eyes filled with unspoken words. It seemed they had something to say, but they were hesitant to share it. Finally, it was Clara who broke the silence. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant as she spoke. We don't have anywhere else to go," she said, her eyes not meeting Jonas's. "The town we came from was destroyed." Jonas's brow furrowed, though he said nothing. He had heard rumors of raids and invasions from the outer planets, but he hadn't paid them much attention. He had his own life to worry about. Still, there was something in the way Clara spoke that made him feel uneasy. There was more to their story than they were letting on, but Jonas had learned long ago not to ask questions if people didn't want to answer. Anna, sensing Jonas's silence, spoke next. "It was an alien attack," she said quietly. "They came out of nowhere, burned the town to the ground. Our husbands, they didn't make it." Jonas didn't respond right away. He had never been one for comforting words, and he wasn't sure what to say. He knew loss, of course. Everyone did. But he had never known the kind of loss these women had experienced, and for a brief moment he found himself at a loss for words. "I'm sorry," he muttered finally, though it felt hollow. He didn't know how to offer comfort. He had never learned how. The women nodded, their faces somber. They didn't seem to expect more from him, and for that, Jonas was grateful. They had asked for shelter, and he had given it to them. That was all they needed from him. There would be no talk of emotions or the past, just the warmth of the fire, the comfort of silence. As the night deepened and the storm continued to rage outside, Jonas realized something. He had always been content with his solitude, but now, with these two women sitting in his cabin, he felt a strange sense of responsibility. They had no place to go, and for whatever reason they had come to him for help. And though he didn't know it yet, this small act of kindness would change everything. The fire crackled softly, the heat from the flames mixing with the cold air that had followed the two women inside. Jonas kept his distance, sitting in the corner of the cabin, his sharp eyes watching the women. He could sense their unease, the silent questions that hung between them like an unspoken promise. He knew they had stories to tell, but they weren't ready to share them yet. Anna sat close to the fire, her arms wrapped around her knees, while Clara, the shorter of the two, stared into the flames as if seeking answers in their dance. The only sound in the room was the occasional gust of wind that rattled the windows and the distant rumble of thunder outside. It was as if the world beyond the cabin was waiting for something, a moment of truth, perhaps. Jonas leaned back in his chair and studied them quietly. He had never been one to talk much. Life on the mountain had taught him the value of silence, of not asking questions that didn't need to be answered. But tonight, the silence between them felt heavy, filled with things left unsaid. Something in him urged him to speak, to break the tension, but he didn't know where to start. Finally, it was Anna who spoke, her voice soft but steady. "We didn't expect this," she said, looking up at Jonas. Her face was pale, and her eyes held a deep sorrow, the kind of sorrow that only comes from losing everything. "We didn't know where to go." Jonas didn't respond right away. He didn't know what to say. He had lived alone for so long that words often escaped him, but he knew this much. These women were lost. They had been through something terrible, and now they had nowhere to turn. "You're safe here," Jonas said finally, his voice rough with the weight of the words. It wasn't much, but it was all he could offer. He didn't have comfort or answers, but he had shelter, and for now, that would have to be enough. Clara glanced at Anna, and the two women exchanged a look that spoke volumes. There was something more they wanted to say, something they were holding back. But for a moment, neither of them spoke. They were hesitant, unsure of how much to reveal. The grief they carried was a heavy burden, and the last thing they wanted was to unload it onto a stranger, even if that stranger was offering them refuge. Jonas, sensing their reluctance, didn't press them. He understood the need for silence, the need to keep certain things buried. He wasn't one to pry, but something told him that these women had seen things, horrible things, that had left their mark. And though he was a man of few words, he knew that the only way to truly help them was to give them time. Time to heal, time to speak when they were ready. After a long pause, Clara finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "The town we came from, it's gone," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she fiddled with the edges of her sleeve. "We didn't think it could happen." Not like that. Jonas didn't speak, but he nodded. He had heard rumors about raids, about alien invasions that had torn apart whole settlements. It wasn't the first time he had heard of such things, but he had never thought it would reach so close to his own mountain. He had always been isolated, distant from the rest of the world. But now, the world seemed to be creeping closer, creeping into his quiet life. Anna spoke up, her voice breaking the silence that had settled over the room. "The aliens, they came out of nowhere. They burned everything. People died. Our husbands..." Her words trailed off, and for a moment she couldn't continue. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if trying to block out the images that haunted her. "We were lucky to escape with our lives." Jonas's heart tightened at her words. He knew loss. He had felt it in his own way, though he had never experienced anything as devastating as what these women had gone through. His thoughts turned briefly to the life he had chosen, the solitude he had embraced. He had never wanted this kind of pain, but now, with these women in his cabin, he realized that the quiet had come with a cost. Anna continued, her voice more steady now, though the pain still lingered. We ran when the soldiers came to warn us.
We didn't know where to go. We didn't know what to do.
She looked up at Jonas, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. You don't have to help us. We can leave, if you want us to. Jonas shook his head, his gaze firm. No, he said. You're staying. You've already made it this far. You're not going back out there in that storm. The women were silent, the weight of Jonas's words settling in the room. They were stranded with nowhere to go. Their world had been torn apart, and now they were here, in this small cabin, with a man who had lived alone for as long as he could remember. He didn't have much, but he had what they needed. Safety, for now. For a moment no one spoke. The storm outside howled louder, and the wind shook the cabin walls. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, filling the room with warmth. The silence between them felt less heavy now, as if the women had found some comfort in Jonas's words, in the knowledge that they weren't alone anymore. I know it's hard, Jonas said quietly after a while. The world's changing, and not for the better, but you're safe here as long as you need. Anna and Clara nodded, their expressions softening. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since the attack they felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. As the night wore on, the storm outside began to die down, though the air still held a chill. The fire continued to burn brightly, casting flickering shadows across the cabin. Jonas didn't know how long they would stay, but for now he was content with the company. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Later, as the women drifted off to sleep, Jonas remained awake, his thoughts turning inward. He had always lived alone, but now, with Anna and Clara in his cabin, he found himself questioning everything. The life he had chosen, the isolation he had embraced, it didn't seem as fulfilling as it once had. There was more to life than solitude. Maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong all along. And as the night deepened and the world outside quieted, Jonas realized something he hadn't known before. He wasn't as alone as he had thought. He had been given a chance to change, a chance to be something more than just the lonely mountain man. Jonas had never been one for long nights of deep thought, but as he lay awake in the darkness of his cabin, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the new reality that had settled in. Anna and Clara were here, staying with him, but something about the night felt different. The wind outside had calmed, but the storm in his mind refused to dissipate. It was late into the night when Jonas heard something that sent a cold shiver down his spine. There was a strange sound coming from outside, a mechanical hum that wasn't natural to the mountains. He rose from his bed quickly, his instincts kicking in. The sound wasn't a creature, it wasn't the storm, it was something else, something man-made. He grabbed his rifle, a tool he had kept for protection, and crept to the window, his breath held in suspense. The moonlight reflected off the snow-covered ground outside, casting an eerie glow across the landscape. There, at the edge of the woods, he saw them. Shadows moving silently under the cover of night. Their shapes were large, dark, and unnatural. Jonas's heart pounded in his chest. The creatures in the woods were no longer just rumors. He knew what they were. They were Zarvok, the same alien invaders that had torn through the settlement Anna and Clara came from. His pulse quickened as he realized that they were closing in on his cabin. Jonas's mind raced. He needed to protect the women. He couldn't let them face this danger again. They had already been through too much. He had lived alone for so long, without having to care for anyone else. But now, with them in his home, he realized that his life was no longer just about survival. It was about protecting those who needed him. He made a decision. He couldn't wait. He moved quickly, waking Anna and Clara with quiet urgency. "The Zarvok are out there," he whispered, his voice filled with gravity. "We need to move, now." The two women woke with a start, their eyes wide with fear. Clara reached for her coat, her hands shaking. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jonas didn't have time for explanations. "Get your things. I'll protect you. We'll leave the cabin." Anna and Clara nodded, quickly grabbing their belongings. There was no time for anything else. The Zarvok would be here soon, and Jonas knew that they had no chance if they stayed put. Jonas led the women out the back door into the cold night. The snow crunched beneath their feet, and the biting wind stung their faces. They moved quickly, staying low, and Jonas kept watch as they made their way through the trees. His heart raced, his thoughts focused on keeping them safe. The distant hum of the Zarvok ships grew louder, their heavy footsteps shaking the ground. Jonas had fought in skirmishes before, but never like this. He wasn't just fighting for survival now. He was fighting for these women, for their lives. And that made all the difference. As they neared a small cave Jonas knew about, he turned to the women. "We're almost there," he said, trying to reassure them, though he knew they could hear the tension in his voice. "Stay close, and don't make a sound." The cave was small, but it would be enough to keep them hidden for a while. Jonas made sure the women were inside. Then he took up a position at the entrance, watching the shadows for any signs of movement. He could see them now, the Zarvok scouts, their towering forms moving slowly through the woods, scanning the area with their alien technology. Jonas's breath caught in his throat as one of the scouts moved too close to their hiding place. He was almost discovered. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he held his breath, praying the creature wouldn't find them. It seemed like an eternity, but finally the scout moved on. Jonas exhaled slowly, his heart still racing. He didn't know how much longer he could keep this up, but for now, they were safe. The Zarvok hadn't found them. After what felt like hours, the sound of the Zarvok machines finally faded into the distance. Jonas waited a few more moments before lowering his guard. "They're gone," he whispered to the women, his voice hoarse from the tension. "For now." Anna and Clara slowly emerged from the cave, their faces pale with fear but also with relief. They had survived the night, but Jonas knew this wasn't over. The Zarvok were still out there, and they would be back. "They couldn't stay hidden forever. We can't go back," Clara said, her voice shaking. "Our town, it's gone. They'll never leave us alone." Jonas nodded grimly. "We'll figure it out, but for now we need to get to safety." The trio trekked through the snow, moving deeper into the mountains where the Zarvok were less likely to patrol. The cold was biting, but Jonas kept his mind focused on keeping them moving. He didn't know what their next step would be, but he knew that staying in one place was dangerous. As they reached the next ridge, Jonas heard something strange in the distance, a deep rumbling sound, followed by a flash of light. He stopped, his instincts flaring. He turned to the women. "Stay here," he ordered. "I'll check it out." Anna and Clara didn't argue. They had learned to trust him, and in this wild, dangerous world, trust was the one thing that could keep them alive. Jonas crept forward, his eyes scanning the landscape. What he saw made his blood run cold. A massive Zarvok ship was landing in the valley below. It was even bigger than the ones he had seen before, and it seemed to be part of a larger fleet. "They're coming," Jonas muttered to himself, dread washing over him. He turned back to the women, his mind working quickly. There was no time to waste. He had to get them out of here, away from the Zarvok and their invasion.
"We need to move now," he said, urgency in his voice.
"We're not safe here anymore. Let's go." The women followed Jonas as he led them deeper into the mountains, away from the impending danger. The future was uncertain, but they had one thing on their side. They had each other. As they moved further away from the valley, the mountain trail grew steeper, the terrain more challenging. But Jonas's determination kept him focused, and Anna and Clara followed closely behind. The cold air nipped at their faces, but it was a small price to pay for the safety Jonas was trying to secure for them. After a long, exhausting journey through the rugged landscape, they finally reached a small, hidden valley that Jonas had once used as a refuge during his solitary days. It was secluded, shielded by dense trees and high ridges, a perfect place to regroup and plan their next move. Jonas looked around, taking in the peaceful surroundings, the silence of the valley. It was hard to believe that just days ago he had been living in peaceful isolation, not knowing the horrors that lay beyond his mountains. But now, with Anna and Clara by his side, the quiet seemed different. It was no longer just solitude, it was safety for them all. "We'll make camp here," Jonas said, his voice steady. "For now we're safe, but we can't stay here forever." Anna and Clara nodded, though they both seemed exhausted. They had been through so much in such a short time, and Jonas could see the toll it had taken on them. But they were survivors, just like him. And together, they would make it through. As the days passed, Jonas worked tirelessly to fortify their camp. He hunted for food, gathered firewood, and made sure the women were as comfortable as possible in their new temporary home. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them safe for now. In the evenings, the three of them would sit around the fire, sharing stories of their pasts. Anna and Clara spoke of their homes, of the lives they had once known, and Jonas listened quietly, offering a few words of his own when they needed him. It was a strange feeling, having company again. But Jonas realized, slowly, that it wasn't as bad as he had thought. He wasn't alone anymore. He had a family now, something he had never expected. As the weeks passed, Jonas found himself beginning to care more deeply for these two women. They weren't just survivors. They were strong, determined, and brave. And with each passing day, he felt his old world of solitude slipping away. The thought of returning to that quiet, lonely existence no longer seemed as appealing. One night, as they sat by the fire, Clara turned to Jonas, her eyes soft. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For everything. We wouldn't have made it without you." Jonas nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "You're part of this now. We're in this together." The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Jonas felt a spark of hope. Together, they would face whatever came next. And whatever the world threw at them, they would stand together as a family.